Hey guys, it's the weekend again, so back to some dedicated work on my Knight Titan. Where I left off last, I had done the weapon assemblies, and what I have done in preparation of the magnets for the torso is I've just done a dry fit on the main torso, and I've given this a base coat of black paint. Pretty much just using the basic Games Workshop primer, black primer. Nothing too special about that. It dries fairly fast, which is good. You can generally give it a good spray. Wait 20 minutes, I usually find, and everything is pretty much perfect. So keeping in mind that there are still going to be parts that are going to be attached on the sides here, I've just done a dry fit, so some of these parts will still come off. The housings here for the arms, which will slot in over here, because they are still to be attached, what I've done is I've just used some blue tack or some poster tack, whatever it's called in your particular area, and I just put that down over areas where I know that I'm going to need a clear surface to put the glue, and so then that gets spray painted, and then I can just peel all of this excess off, and you're left with a nice clear surface underneath. You can do it without, like you can just spray paint the whole thing and cover up those nubs, you know, whatever areas you want. But then you have to go back and scrape away the paint to get a clean fit anyway, because you can't really have the glue on a painted surface, otherwise you'll just pull whatever it is away and it's just paint on paint, so you don't really get a good bond there. So anyway, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take these bits apart, and just going to show you a few techniques on the paint scheme using the paints that I have and the inks. So I'm just going to take all the stuff apart, and we'll get set up and ready for a painting demonstration. So stay tuned. Okay, so I've got everything pulled apart, and time to get into the painting side of things. So what I've been doing for the most part with the metallic pieces is I've been using a dry brush technique, which basically is a method of getting the paint onto the surface details, but not necessarily into every single crevice. So it means that you still get shadows and shading in there, and then you can go back and pick out the details a little bit more later. So the paint I use for this effect as my base coat is just some bolt gun metal, and this is just basic Citadel paint, showing its age now, I guess, because I don't think they do bolt gun metal anymore. I think it's called something else, lead belcher or something like that. I still have quite a selection of old paints that have lasted me for quite a few years, although this one's getting quite low now. So I'm just using all of those up, a different name, doesn't matter, a rose by any other name. So for dry brushing, you want to have a fairly thick consistency of paint. Normally you would sort of have what they usually describe as a milky consistency for regular paints, metallics, because you've got the granules in there. You usually want to keep it a little thicker, because if you water it down too much, the pigments will separate, and it doesn't get a very good finish. So basically what I'm just going to do is just give this a bit of a shake, get it all in there, and because I'm going to be working on a fairly large area, I'm going to use a larger brush for the dry brushing. Now there's a couple of things to consider, I guess. Is that this is just a real basic paintbrush. Nothing flash about this. This isn't like a proper sable, brush. It's just kind of rough and ready. But you still want to make sure that you've got a certain softness to it, because you're going to want to get a good coverage across the model. And if the bristles are too thick and too coarse, it's just going to be kind of scraping the paint along rather than giving it a nice soft coat. So for example, this is a smaller brush, and I could do a similar sort of thing, but it actually is a bit stiffer, and so you wouldn't get the nice soft consistency going across. It would look a little bit too scratchy with the pigments drawing across. So I'm going with a larger, sort of softer brush that's going to get the details there. Now the thing is with this is that this is your sort of rough and ready coat, so there's nothing that needs to be too neat about this initially. You can always go back, tidy things up, no big deal. And because these are water-based paints, they're sort of non-toxic, they're just real user-friendly, idiot-proof almost for someone like me. And what I'm doing is I'm just getting some paint on there. I don't want to dip it right into the pot, because otherwise you're just going to load up way too much paint. You don't get a lot of control. So what I do is I just usually grab it from the inside of the lid there, and not too much, but then you're still going to want to take most of the paint off. So I just keep a piece of paper towel handy, and I'm just going to drag the brush across there. I'm sorry that's not actually in proper focus, but this is the main point. And yeah, just going to go along. Now the trick is that if you drag the brush across in one direction only, you're going to get streaks, and that's not going to look very good. That's going to look very artificial. It's going to look painted, basically. So to get an even sort of texture, just give it a swirl. So you're dragging it back and forth, up and down, and then just getting in there and just giving the bristles a real swirl, and this will sort of create that brushed metallic look that's going to give it an even texture. Now for a model this size, you don't need to worry too much about getting into every nook and cranny, because if you think about the scaling of this, if you were infantry walking next to this, there would be very, very dark areas of shadow. You would not see all of the crisp detail as you do. So you don't have to cover absolutely everything. It's okay to have dark areas in there. It doesn't have to be totally lit. Obviously, once you have a certain level of lighting and thinking about the direction that the light is coming from, but it doesn't have to be bright, glaring everywhere. You're allowed to keep parts in shadow. And so basically this is just a real quick brush over, but already you've got lots of detailing in there, and it just picks everything out really nicely. So again, I'm just going to load up a bit of paint on there, and with this other piece, same sort of deal. And the plan is, like with the other pieces, with the legs and the arms, is that you can highlight all of this with the metal, and then you can tone it back. So if it looks a little too light, then you can just grab your inks, and I will do a demonstration with those, and tone it right back. sort of acts as a good wash, which will pull in the recesses and sort of tone down some of that extra brightness, just gives it a slightly more realistic look. And the colour of the wash that you use as well will add to the grit and the grime. If you wanted a nice sort of high-end metallic finish, you could use a blue wash, and sort of gives it a real... The blue just really picks out the different cold shades of the metal. I'm going for a brown wash and a black wash, which will just make it look a bit grimy, like it's been out in the field. Lots of grease, keep everything moving, that sort of thing. So there we go. I mean, just in that short amount of time, I've been able to do those two sections there, and it's really good preparation just to figure out what parts are going to be standing out, to be highlighted. You can see that there are tubes and pipes detailing all this sort of thing, and those, I can get my other metallic colours and I will pick those out to make them stand out. But just as a rough and ready base coat, just nothing beats dry brushing like that. It's really good. So I'm going to continue working on some of these pieces, and then we'll pick out some of the details. So there we go. Thanks. Alright, here's an update moving on from the dry brushing onto some ink work. What I have done since you last saw me was I have picked out various details in different metallic paints. Just out of the range of paints that I've got here, I've used some of my own mix of brazen brass and some dwarf bronze on the piping, some gold, shining gold on the eagle heads, and just gone in and just picked out a few details there. Nothing too precise, just to give it a quick look of different colours. The metallics are all pretty much in the same sort of pot styles. I just have my own mix of brazen brass here from an old pottle. They don't produce that anymore, so I had to make up my own mixture using two different ones. It's unfortunately one of the side effects when you've started over several years to paint your models a certain way, and then they change the paint range. You sort of have to find alternatives or make them. But anyway, so I've got the main pieces here set up as I want, and I'm going to use some black ink. Now, an ink it's similar to just a watered down paint, really. I'm not totally sure of the exact qualities and mixtures of it, but it's really just a very watery consistency. As it is, out of the straight out of the pot there would actually be too dark, too strong for how I would like it. It would actually make everything look far too dark for my liking. So what I do is I've got my little palette here, and I'm just going to mix some of the ink in with a little bit of water. So I've just got my little syringe here, and I basically just fill that up with a little bit of water, and I can use this to just fill up a couple of these little divots here. And I use this for watering down the paints as well, just putting a few drops into the pot, giving it a shake, mix it all up. And then I've just got some used toothpicks, or the bamboo skewers that you sometimes can get. I just chop those up and I use them to stir the paints. I'm just going to grab some ink out of the bottle here, and I'm just going to mix that into the water. And obviously having less, or having a more dilute mixture, is easier to work with than having it too thick, because you can always go back over multiple times to get the effect that you want. Now, these are fairly large areas, and I don't have to be too discriminating about where the ink is going to go. I'm just going to make sure I don't get it on the eagle heads there. I'm going to keep those pristine, but the rest of all this detail I'm going to put the ink in. Now, the reason for using inks is that it's designed to get into the crevices and the cracks, and it's just going to flow into there, and it'll leave the other areas slightly more highlighted. It will sort of stain the rest of the area, but if it's dilute enough it won't be a big difference, and then you can always go over the base areas again, and I'll be doing some highlights as well, which I'll show you once I've done the step. So I'm just going to use a large brush. This is seen better days, so it's less used for details now and just for applying the wash. So I'm just going to get that and dab it in there, and just get the ink and just give it a wash, especially over the pipes that I've picked out, because they are going to get the most benefit from the inks getting into the crevices. So you'll have the main colours, and then you'll have the shades in the crevices there, and it'll just make them stand out from the surrounding area, but it will also just create a certain consistency, this certain overlayering in there, which will sort of bring everything together. So if there's anything that's really bright, it just tones it down, just brings it back a little bit, so that it gives it that sort of used, grungy sort of look. The only downside with the washes, the inks, is that they do tend to take a little while to dry. So it's not something that you can quickly go back and paint over and highlight. So you want to give yourself plenty of time to let these dry. It's good for things like picking out details of the rivets and things like that, because the darker area will it'll pull around the rivets, but it'll still leave the heads of the rivets quite clear. So there we go. That's getting into there, and yeah, it does look relatively dark. You can always just, if it's too thick in areas, you can just get your brush and give it a bit of a water down and just spread things around a little bit. You don't want to leave it to pull too much, otherwise you'll end up with a very splotchy effect. So if you can see that it's getting too thick in areas, then you can just sort of dab it off. You could use like a cotton swab, I suppose, if you wanted to do that, or like a Q-tip or something like that. So just getting that in there and gunking that up, and we'll do the same thing over here. If you find that it's too thick, you can always add a little bit more water. If it's too thin, you can always add a little bit more ink, because you've got plenty of time for it to dry. Nothing is set in stone. And again, if you realize that you've gone a little overboard, you can just water it down, use your brush to clean some of it out, and then it's just a simple matter of going over with the highlighting again. So it's a fairly basic way, quick way of just getting in to pick out those details. So once the black ink is dry, I am going to get some brown ink. Just dip my brush in a bit of water here just so I can draw the ink around. I'm going to get some brown ink, and I'm going to not apply it over everything, but just sort of get into the areas where there might be some more moving parts, maybe where there's been a little bit of oil and grease that sort of leaked, where it's taken some damage, or just where things have moved and deposited grit and grime. And again, once this is all dry, we can go over and we can create some highlights. I'm sorry if that's not quite in the right area. You get the general idea. It's just getting in there, highlighting all that detail. And again on this piece, just getting it in there to gunk it up. You're going to want to be fairly careful that you don't embed brush strokes or fingerprints on this as well. If it gets too splotchy where your hands have been, or where the brush has sort of pulled too much of it, it can end up looking quite fake. So it just takes a little bit of practice, and just a lot of winging it, a lot of just having a look, seeing what works for you, what the effect is that you want, and not being afraid to go back and change it. I've had occasions where I've tried something that hasn't worked, and basically just gone back, redone the whole thing. It's okay to feel, sort of, that's kind of good enough, but don't be afraid to say, you know what, this didn't work out as I planned, and I'm going to redo it. So there we go. That's just a real quick and easy way to add some extra depth to your model piece. So I'm going to let that all dry, and then we'll go over with the brown ink, and I'll show you a few key areas with that. So there we go. Thanks. Okay, moving on to the brown inks. Pretty much exactly the same as what I was doing with the black inks, except I'm going to be a little bit more selective about where these are going to go. So I've already set up the ink in my palette. I'm just going to focus around some of the larger pipings, just into some of these areas where you might expect grime to sort of get in. Just thinking back to when I used to muck around with my grandfather pulling apart old motor mowers and things like that, you'd get this level of grime and grease. So not going over so much of the base metallic parts, but just some of the joins where the piping goes, just keeping a lot of the surface detail a lot clearer than what we've done with the previous washes. So just being a little more targeted with that aspect of it. It's just more for specific areas than for an overall wash like the black one was. Just gives it another little dimension. If you wanted to do something like, you could probably make yourself up like a red ink an orangey sort of ink and do a sort of rust corrosion sort of effect. I'm not going for that so much, but you could mix up your own inks and just sort of see how it works for you. Just takes the sort of new shiny look off some of these. I understand you can probably get a good effect using like weathering powders. I haven't spent any time with weathering powders. I don't really know how they work, but I understand that for some of the large vehicles with lots of weathering effects, probably look that sort of stuff up on YouTube. But just for my purposes, just getting in here with some of these engine bits, giving another little dimension of colour. The other thing too with a little bit of browning, because it'll just it'll warm things up a little bit, like the black is in there, really tones it down, but the brown will sort of warm the palette up a little bit. So just getting into some of these crevices and just giving it that little extra dash of colour. When I was working on the pistons for the arms, for example, the piston back here, I would actually get the brown ink straight out of the pot and just run it along there, and it gives it, that's not as thick as a paint, but you can still get that sort of industrial look. But there's no pistons on these main pieces here, so it's just going to be used as a wash. Then once these dry, I'm going to go back over and do a dry brush highlight using some chainmail, but I'll show you how that works once these are all dry. Okay, the inks are all dry, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over the metal areas again, and you can see that they're all quite dark now because of the inks that have gone in there. So what I want to do is do a light dry brush with a lighter metallic, just to pick out the edges and just make it look like the light reflecting off there. So the way that I've been doing the painting at the moment, we have our base coat of bolt gun metal. You also have two other shades, which is chainmail and mithril silver, and each one is lighter than the other. On the legs of the Titan and on the arms, I have done an extreme highlight of mithril silver on the areas of silver, the lighter areas. The sort of oily areas of the legs, I have done a very, very light brush of that. But because we're dealing with more of an underside area of the Titan, I won't need to do such an extreme highlight. I'm just going to use a highlight of the chainmail, which is just a mid-tone, and I'm just going to do a very sparse dry brush of that, just to pick out some of the details. So I'm just going to get my little toothpick, just give these a bit of a stir, and just put the excess in the lid there. So rather than waste paint, I'm just going to dab my brush across there, just pick some up, and then take most of it off on the paper towel. Now I'm going to try and keep this fairly focused, because we don't just want to undo all of the shading that we've done. So I'm just going to brush along the edges just picking out the highlights on the sharp edges rather than doing the whole thing. So really it's very subtle highlighting, not even like noticeable straight away to the eye. It's just going to get in there and just put a little bit in there across the rivets, so that the tops of the rivets just sort of stand out a little bit. Maybe a smaller brush would be better for that actually, but that's working alright. Just very, very light. Again, you don't want to over highlight anything, because again this is part of the model that's going to be underneath. You're going to have the carapace that sits across the top, so you imagine that there's not going to be a lot of light getting in there. But it just kind of gives it a little subtle variation. If I was using the mithril silver, again this would be highlighted even further, but this is just sort of one stage up. It's very subtle highlight. And if you imagine the way that you are dragging your brush will sort of mimic where the light is going to be coming in. So you're not just slathering it all over, you're just kind of picking out the areas that the light would be striking as it comes in. Just done a few extra pieces here which I didn't do on camera. So this is the area where the headpiece is going to go into. I'll be doing a separate video on the face part, probably just to show off the eyes when I paint out the eyes. It just gives it a subtle variation so that you don't just have the same bland dark metallic colour going across everything, just the shades and the highlights, and it all works together to make it look like it would be a real object. Well, it's obviously a real object, but the size and the scale to turn a miniature into a bigature, I guess you would say, as they refer to them at Weta Workshop. So there we go, just some very subtle highlighting on there, and that should all go together quite nicely. And what I'll do in areas like this is I will go back with the original colour. So we started with the original colour, toned it down with the black ink and the brown ink, and so I'll just go back over and just pick out a few little bits, just so that it looks like the light reflecting off there. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of painting to go along with the model build. I quite enjoy this part of the process. I'm going to be moving on to the top part a little bit later. That's going to be more of a red colour, so I didn't want to give that just a big dry brush. That'll be done a little bit differently. But there we go, we are making progress. So stay tuned, and we'll get some more videos out there as I make some more progress. Thanks.